So, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. I've got two recommendations. Please comply. Masks, please keep your masks, because even the President of the Senate has asked, even when we are speaking on the stage, that we should wear masks. The second is for the interpreters. They have asked me, and for those who wish to speak, if you're a French speaker, please speak in French. Please, you choose either French or English. Foreigners could speak English or French as they wish, but please speak in your native tongue if you're French. It makes things much more comfortable for everyone. So please prefer speaking in French. If you don't speak French, then speak in English, no problem. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, hello everyone. Hello to everyone who are joining us remotely via video conference. I see everyone is connected. I'm delighted to welcome you this morning to the Senate. I'm doing so on behalf of President Lashi, who has entrusted me with this task since an emergency unfortunately prevents him from opening this colloquium as planned. But the question that brings us together today, namely what place for national parliaments in the European edifice, is so important to him that he wishes to take part in this event in spite of everything. He will therefore join us around noon. I'm very grateful to him in advance for the consideration he's showing for our work. What place for national parliaments in the European edifice? This is a legitimate question, given the large number of European institutions. Is there any need to add another player to a game that is already so complex and difficult for our fellow citizens to understand? We must ask this question now. On the one hand, because the Conference on the Future of Europe, which opened last May, invites us to reflect on the functioning of the Union. On the other hand, because we are on the eve of the 6-month period in which France will find itself at the heart of the European machinery by presiding in turn over the Council of the European Union. The Committee on European Affairs, which I have the honour of chairing, has just consulted locally elected representatives online on their perception of the European Union, their vision of its future. Nearly 2,000 of them took part in this consultation. And what do they tell us? Of course, they associate the European Union with positive values, but they perceive it primarily as a bureaucratic and distant machine which does not pay sufficient attention to the territories in their diversity. It's precisely for this reason that national parliaments have their place. It is not a question of adding complexity to complexity or institutions on top of institutions. Allow me to spoiler this. Perhaps this is a very youthful term, but to spoil this colloquy, I was wanting to say of a thriller or a television series, or to divulge it in proper French, or in the Picard language, by giving you the answer to today's question. What is expected of the national parliaments is they should bring democracy back into the bureaucracy, and thus, in the final analysis, a legitimacy into European construction. Their contribution to the proper functioning of the European Union has, moreover, been gradually recognised and enshrined in the Treaty of Lisbon. Yes, but what is the actual contribution of the national parliaments? This is a fascinating question because it's far from being settled. The Senate has been working on it for a long time. Many of you are also looking for an answer. And I would like to thank each of you here in the Senate or from different parts of Europe for agreeing to share with us today the fruit of your reflections. It appears to us today that our questions could be organised around 4 themes, which will give rise to 4 sessions during this symposium. The first area is the relationship between each parliament and its own government with regard to European policy, the policy that it runs, and in particular the positions that it champions at the Council. This political question is fundamental because it operates at 2 levels. First of all, at national level, it's primordial to ensure that the entire fields of governmental initiative does not escape parliamentary scrutiny. The question of sovereignty towards the Union can also be seen as a transfer of competency from parliaments to their governments, because in these fields, and this is although things have been conceded to the European collectively, depend on votes from parliament. Then, at the community level, this is a question of filling in a gap. And what's at stake here is to ensure the democratic issues. In order to ensure this, the national parliaments are irreplaceable. By monitoring the European action of its own government altogether, they democratize the functioning of the Council. The second theme is that of the institutional role that the national parliaments must play in the European edifice. They have been entrusted with controlling, with monitoring respect for subsidiarity. This opens the possibility of a larger direct dialogue, and this is definitely represents progress, but it is insufficient. It leaves too much, the national parliaments are too far away from the European decision-making process. It's not simply a question of transposing European directives, but a question of involving them in the decision-making process at the European level in terms of legislation. The third theme is the future of cooperation between parliaments. And this could be a new collective form of democratic scrutiny of European decision-making. And finally, we will devote the fourth and last session of our colloquium to a tension which is currently arising between national parliaments as a constitutive power and in European construction. This is tension, which is the nature of the European Union itself, united in diversity, to quote its motto. This is there are debates which are proving fruitful all around Europe, with parliaments working within the respect of their national constitutions. President Larcher will get back on to these subjects because he will be speaking to us before we tackle them. I would now like to start our works and open our first session devoted to the parliamentary scrutiny of European policy. President Bérégovoy's government was only 3 months away from being sanctioned. This was a question of the reform of the common agricultural policy. What was important was that Parliament should scrutinize and monitor governmental activity. The positions that are defended in Brussels or Luxembourg engage before the government is engaged before the Parliament in Paris. Now, this monitoring, this scrutiny had some specificities. So often information is asymmetric between Parliament and government, who have governmental bills and drafts, but which is engaged in negotiation, and so there is a balance of power here. This legislative activity, the agenda is different from the national agenda, and with stakeholders who are also different. And this is what, in particular, justified the creation in the National Parliament of the European Affairs Committee in order to absorb these differences. The main difficulty lies in the fact that the Council works through negotiation, which implies confidentiality and backroom discussions, and which upsets the balance of power, which is so necessary. Negotiations with European Parliament often involve 3 parties. All the parliaments in the European Union have had to confront themselves with these difficulties, and it's interesting to note that the diversity of responses, each with their own parliamentary traditions and its own legal systems and its own laws. I'm delighted that this first session allows us to study this diversity, and I hope we're able to get into the experiences lived through by each national parliament. And what tools does each national parliament have with regard to its own government in view of negotiations underway? Should we, for example, listen to ministers in private in order not to perturb negotiations? And does parliamentary control operate well? In this context, the French system is the French system good, and can we improve it? Thank you very much. So I would like to suggest, not following the first questions, we're going to invite a first intervention by Madame Elena Griglio, who I think will...
I'm going to share my screen. Ja, dat. Can you see the screen? Can you now see the screen or not?
Me paraît revêtre un intérêt non seulement particulier à cause du moment au cours auquel elle intervient, mais aussi par la diversité des intervenants qui, comme elle est qui nous
So it's particularly interesting to have several representatives from national parliaments. So I would like to give the floor to Elena Grillo. She's going to give a presentation on national parliaments and an overview of trends. I think Elena had a presentation. Elena is both at the Italian Senate and also electra.
Can you hear me? Sorry. Can you hear me now? Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, Elena, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much to the French Senate and to the Committee on European Affairs for the kind invitation. I am extremely honored and glad to be part of this outstanding seminar. And let me sincerely apologize for not being able to attend in presence, but some pending commitments relating to my professional position in the Italian Senate have prevented me to be in Paris today. So my task is to provide an analysis, a comparative analysis of the national circuits of parliamentary oversight of EU affairs. And I will now share my screen. Okay, can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so it's to provide an overview of the national circuits of parliamentary oversight, main trends and existing gaps, also focusing on the role of the Italian and the Finnish Senate as case studies. So I think that, can you see the next slide, the image? I hope that you can see it well, because this image provides an overview of the two circuits that compose national parliament scrutiny of the EU affairs. On the one hand, we have the European circuit, which connects national parliaments directly to European institutions through the early warning mechanism and through the political dialogue. And the circuit will be the main topic of next session. My presentation will rather focus on the other circuit, on the national circuit, which connects national parliaments to the domestic government. And this national circuit of the scrutiny of EU affairs relies on the use of standard domestic parliamentary tools, and it has a much wider scope related to compare to the European circuit, because national parliaments, by scrutinizing their own governments, can scrutinize European legislative and non-legislative acts, the participation in European intergovernmental bodies, and also national EU-related acts. So 3 different objects. And what's important to underline is that by scrutinizing the national governments, national parliaments are also able to exercise an indirect impact on European institutions. And to explain this indirect influence, I will now move to this image, which gives an idea of how national scrutiny of EU affairs can exercise an influence on the interaction of the national government with both supranational and intergovernmental institutions. Of course, the first and most obvious indirect influence is on intergovernmental institutions, because national parliaments can scrutinize their own governments for their participation in the Council and in the European Council. And the type of influence that they can exercise on these intergovernmental institutions depends on the voting procedures in the Council and European Council. We know that the European Councils adopts a consensual decision-making, so the influence of national parliaments is quite strong. By contrast, the influence on the Council depends on the voting procedures adopted. So when the unanimity rule is at stake, national parliaments can exercise a sort of veto power on the work of the Council. When majority voting is at stake, I mean, their influence is weaker, of course. The Eurogroup represents a sort of black zone in the national circuit of the scrutiny of EU affairs due to the informality of the procedures and also to the low level of transparency. On the other hand, by scrutinizing their own government, parliaments are also able to affect the interaction with the European Commission, especially when the submission of national heads is at stake. But what they cannot influence is the relationship with other supranational institutions, such as the European Central Bank and European agencies, because, I mean, these supranational institutions escape from the interaction between the legislative and the executive branches at the national level. So once clarified the scope and the reach of the national circuit of the scrutiny of European affairs, we can now focus on the determinants of this function. And we should distinguish between legal and pro-legal determinants, because literature has correctly highlighted the influence exercised by legal factors, such as the form of government, the executive-legislative interaction, but also the formal EU powers vested in the national parliament by the constitution, by parliamentary rules of procedures and statutory legislation. But on the other hand, we should consider the influence of pro-legal determinants, such as party politics, executive party dimension, the role of majority imposition. But I also believe that members of the European Affairs Committee know very well how the individual role orientations of MPs, the motivation, the interaction with voters can influence the way in which the committee interprets the scrutiny of EU affairs. And lastly, but not leastly, we must consider the influence of contextual factors, such as crisis. We have experienced major crises in the European Union in the last 20 years. And as I will say in a while, I mean, these have influenced the way in which national parliaments interpret the scrutiny of EU affairs. So combining these factors, the scope, the reach, and the determinants of national parliament scrutiny of EU affairs, we can argue that this is an autonomous parliamentary function with distinctive features, because what parliaments are scrutinizing is their own government, but they produce, in scrutinizing their own government, they produce an extraterritorial effect, because they produce indirect impacts on the new institutions, and they can also produce side effects on other national parliaments and member states. So the scrutiny of EU affairs as a distinctive parliamentary function interacts with all the other traditional functions, such as lawmaking, oversight, the setting of political direction. And this function is also solidly grounded in MPs' domestic tools and procedures, from the gathering of information to the voting of resolutions and mandates. There are six main objects, six main options that shape the way in which national parliaments interpret this function. And first of all, we must consider the legal basis, whether the scrutiny of EU affairs is grounded on the Constitution or on constitutional rules of procedures, or rather it's just grounded on informal practice. The second factor is the object of the scrutiny function. I was mentioning before the three objects that parliaments are scrutinizing, whether they are considering, EU legislative and non-legislative proposal, or rather they are scrutinizing their government participation in the Council and the European Council. That's what we call the procedural scrutiny, or rather they are looking at the adoption of national EU-related acts, such as the recovery and resilience plans, but also the national reform plans and the convergence and stability programs in the European semester architecture. The timing is another relevant factor, whether parliaments are participating in the scrutiny of EU affairs ex ante, during the decision-making process, or ex post, and also the body who is in charge of the scrutiny function, whether it is grounded on the work of the European Affairs Committee only, or whether, the work of the European Affairs Committee is complemented by other sectorial committees. Or the other option is to have the scrutiny of EU affairs focused on the activity of the plenary, which is the outcome of the scrutiny of EU affairs, whether national parliaments are adopting binding mandates on the executive or non-binding resolution, whether the scrutiny function is just about providing transparency and debate to the public, or whether what Parliament is interested in is exercising an informal influence on the government, as in the case of the UK House of Lords. And finally, the party mode, whether European affairs are considered, are tackled in a consensual style between majority and opposition, or whether, these issues rather tend to follow the traditional divide between majority and opposition, or lastly, whether there are strongly competitive attitudes on these issues, because these issues are considered highly controversial in the national debate. So combining these options, literature has identified 5 main scrutiny models. So we have some parliaments who are considered scrutiny laggards, so low level of involvement in EU affairs. Other are rather acting as public fora, so they are grounding the scrutiny of EU affairs on the role of the plenaries. Other parliaments are rather government watchdogs. They are scrutinizing mostly ex post the activity of the government, either in committee and the plenary, or the most advanced models are policy shapers and experts who involve committees in the scrutiny of EU affairs in order to exercise either an ex ante influence on the government or an ex ante expert knowledge. Well, all these models are extremely explicative of the alternative options available to national parliaments, but it also true that we need to consider these models in a dynamic perspective, looking at the influence that the major changes occurred in the last 15 years, 20 years, have exercised on the choices available to national parliaments. And I'm specifically referring to the intensification of the dialogue between MPs, to the new European role attributed to MPs in the scrutiny of the European semester, and as I was mentioning before, on the influence of the major crises. And in order to test how some of the most significant scrutiny models have evolved over time, I have selected Finland and Italy as case studies, because these 2 parliaments represent 2 rather different ways of interpreting the scrutiny of EU affairs. I don't have time to explain the differences, but I think that you are all familiar with the idea that Finland and Italy have 2 rather different constitutional traditions in the relationship between the legislative and the executive branch, and they also have a rather different tradition in the scrutiny of EU affairs. So if we need to focus on the distinctive traditional features of the 2 models, we can argue that the Finnish model is an example of a strong constitutional-based scrutiny of EU affairs, which is based on the role of committees, which is directed at exercising a binding mandate on the government, and which follows the entire decision-making process at the EU level. And it's also based on a consensual style of a relationship between majority and opposition. By contrast, the traditional features of the Italian model is that of an evolving scrutiny model, which has changed significantly after Lisbon, and the scrutiny of EU affairs sees an emerging role of the plenary, especially in the scrutiny of the European Council, and also an occasional role of the committees in the document-based scrutiny. The committees and the plenary are adopting resolutions which are non-binding or mildly binding on the executive, and which follow the traditional majority and opposition divide. Well, both these models, the Finnish and Italian model, which are quite different in the original features, are experiencing a sort of convergence due to the reaction of the two parliaments to the latest crisis, and especially to the Euro crisis and to the COVID-19 crisis, which has activated a recovery package at the European level. Because in Finland, we are experiencing a significant politicization of EU affairs, which is determining the emerging of more voting approaches at committee level instead of unanimous decision making. We are experiencing increasing dissenting opinions of the opposition to committee statements and minutes. And we are also experiencing an increasing role of the plenary, which is, incorporating in the Eduskunta, the Finnish parliament, which traditionally is a working parliament, some features of the so-called talking parliament. By contrast, in the Italian parliament, we are experiencing an attempt to strengthen parliamentary scrutiny of EU affairs by adjusting to the Nordic scrutiny model. So Italy is trying to introduce a systematic procedural scrutiny of the Council, not just of the European Council, and potentially also of the Eurogroup. It is trying to interpret parliamentary resolutions as binding on the executive, and it is also experiencing an increasing fact-finding role of the committees in the recovery governance. So to conclude, we could say that the Italian parliament is shifting to the traditional features of a working parliament. And the very final conclusions of this comparative review is that there are some positive aspects that we can detect, a general enrichment of the scrutiny tools and procedures available to national parliaments, which have led to a cross-fertilization of scrutiny models, spurred by different factors, either domestic political factors, as in the case of Finland, or domestic adaptation to EU and contextual trends in Italy. And this cross-fertilization of scrutiny models has favored the consolidation of national parliament scrutiny of EU affairs as a proper parliamentary function. But of course, we also need to focus on existing gaps, and the Eurogroup, Euro Summit is a black zone, as I was mentioning at the beginning, but also we should consider the partial effects of national parliament scrutiny on the accountability of intergovernmental institutions. And I think that this afternoon session on interparliamentary cooperation will give us the opportunity to see how we can close this gap to the dialogue between national parliaments. So thank you very much for the attention, and that's all for the moment.
Oui, merci infiniment, Elena, pour cette présentation très riche.
Thank you very much, Elena, for this very full presentation, which allows us to situate the debate, not so only with regard to the role of national parliaments, in which you presented very clearly what's the role of the national parliaments very clearly in the Italian and Finnish cases in particular, but also with regard to parliamentary cooperation. And I would like to add that it is these cultural differences and these differences of standing and the position of the different parliaments and the national parliaments in the member states, which make interparliamentary cooperation sometimes a little difficult. I will have other questions, and I would imagine that the audience will also wish to ask questions at the end of the different presentations, but I'm now going to hand over to Didier Blanc for his intervention on the French case. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Mr. Senator, ladies and gentlemen. I'm both honored and happy to be here. Honored, first of all, because it's very important for us university researchers to participate in parliamentary debate, particularly in the Senate, in order to have this view from the university world, which is the executive and the different institutions and assemblies are not always able to have access to our perceptions of what is happening at the level of national parliaments. We often invite you. Yes, I know. I'm also happy because I've been working for a long time on these questions around in the insertion of national parliaments within the context of the European Union. Now I have the task of tackling this question about parliamentary scrutiny in France and the policy of the government. It would seem to me that in this context, there are two strong trends which are powerful and can be observed, and they're implicit. This is not the heart of my business. It's the Constitution and its Europeanization very rapidly. As you must know, in 1979, the assemblies decided to modify the rule of 1958 and to create parliamentary delegations, which is now the Commission of European Affairs of each different assembly. And these delegations simply have a right to information. So it's in the name of their legislative function that the assemblies felt the need to create a scrutiny function, which was specific. And this function was constitutionalized in 1992 in the context of the necessary revision for the ratification of the Treaty of Maastricht. And there again, in the National Assembly and in the Senate, we enriched the constitutional, the government bill, the draft bill, in order to constitutionalize this function with Article 34 of our Constitution. And these, so now these have become revolutions because there is no consultative function in the assemblies. And then in the assemblies, we tried to extend and to improve this means of intervention. And the culminating point, there should be a PowerPoint which should be on the screen here, with the different constitutional provisions which are involved. And so in 2008, in the constitutional revision, within the context of the Treaty of Lisbon, we had a constitutionalization of the organ and the appearance, finally, and because this is what the delegations wished, from the beginning of the 1990s to be recognized, notably with regard to questions involving relations between national parliaments. So on the first slide here, you can see here, in 1992, adding a title to the Constitution, the extension of its field in 1998, and then the constitutionalization of the organ in 2008. And so here, what we can observe here is the function which has created the organ, or the organ created. So this function of scrutiny, which is guided by legislative concerns, is doubly limited. It's first of all limited because precisely within the context of the Constitution, it is manifest as the vote of a resolution, which, of course, within the constitutional context, does not have any constraining aspect. And here we're in a constitutional context. Added to that, the government who wants to monitor the monitoring of we have an internal monitoring, internal scrutiny, and a legislative function, which is the monitoring of the European institutions by the national assemblies. So we have parliamentary scrutiny, which is faced with these two internal contradictions. Then what we see in the next slide, this is the evolution of the activity, because there was a rupture. I was interested to the legislators since Lisbon, so the 14th and 15th, and we see a comparable number of resolutions. The most productive legislature was the 14th, 77 National Assembly and 91 in the Senate. And then from the beginning of the current legislation, there's a real difference because we see in the National Assembly there have only been 22 resolutions which have been adopted under Article 88. We also this is paradoxical because this was at a time when there was a rule relative to accumulation, and it should have allowed the National Assembly to better exercise its scrutiny. So how can we explain this reduction, this historical reduction in the activity of scrutiny by the National Assembly? To my mind, there are three factors here. So this is intuitive. this is something which is currently happening. First of all, there is what I would call a generation effect, as I would call it. The average age of the members of the National Assembly is 51. People have been discovering their political life. There's a new generation of politicians. And there's a certain different familiarity with European affairs. Second question, many of our national parliamentarians of the National Assembly are now are not professional politicians. They have come from professional life elsewhere. And the third reason, perhaps the most obvious, is that because in this assembly it was elected after presidential elections in 2017, we have Emmanuel Macron, new president, promoted a new European policy, and which was pretty open to European construction. On the other hand, we see if there's a virtue, a senatorial virtue, shows that there is a certain continuity. Although it has been diluted, we can see that the numbers of resolutions that have been adopted is pretty much in line with what we could have expected on the basis of history. So here we can see there is a strong evolution. There's a genuine asymmetry between scrutiny between the National Assembly and the Senate. And 88.4 was considered to be a genuine instrument for parliamentary autonomy. But there's another strong trend, and that is that regularly, it's not systematic, but regularly, we have resolutions in the National Assembly and in the Senate, which are voted on an identical text. And what you see in bold here are the resolutions which are adopted in a plenary session. So this is a very strong expression of the two French parliaments, because they examine the same draft and vote on it in plenary sessions. Of course, what I say, the French patience, so that's the CAP. We have the mobility package for 2017-2018 in the National Assembly, and the Senate is very sensitive to questions to free trade agreements. And so since the last two parliamentary sessions, we see there have been no identity between votes of resolutions. This is to be expected because there's a reduction in scrutiny by the National Assembly and an approach which is doubtless different to that pursued in the Senate. So this could explain that evolution. And with regard to Article 88.4, I would say there's a defensive approach by national assemblies, and this is translated into, it's become more offensive. And what we can see is that the political dialogue for non-specialists has become the assemblies. For the Senate, this is a political opinion. With the European Affairs Committee of the National Assembly, this is a conclusion. When I talk about the Senate, that's where the policy is done by the committees responsible for European affairs. So there is some flexibility in this political dialogue. So it's our European Affairs committees who will share their determination, aiming to incite legislation to head in such and such a different direction. And this is how they will influence that legislation. And the new trend in the 15th legislature is that the number of resolutions voted under 88.4. Here we can see in 2017-2018 there have been 19 resolutions, which have been doubled by 19 pieces of political advice on the mobility package. And the same thing applies in the National Assembly. And so we see in 2021 there's a reduction again. So I don't know to what we could attribute this reduction. If we understand the idea of doubling scrutiny, which is more offensive under 88.4, what we call a green card in certain circumstances, the danger is that we denature the Article 88.4. Why denature it? Because I'm observing that very often the difference between the content of 88.4 in the Senate and political advice from the committee responsible for European affairs. So here again, there is a new trend. The last new trend is and that we're seeing a reduction of resolutions 88.4 in public session. And so since 2018-2019, there have been none since the beginning of, since 2 years ago. And so the difficulty is this is traditional, historic, but which is reinforced here. The parliamentary scrutiny of the policy of the government has ever since before Article 88 and in 79 and 2014 means that there is less visibility of this parliamentary scrutiny, thanks to this absence of this dilution of resolutions voted for in public sessions. So here we see this in this evolution. So before we move into the proposal phase, since 2014, Euro Committee for European Affairs decided to establish a monitoring, and you should remember that in 1995, the committee responsible for the question of the Union, chaired by Robert Control, there was only one report in the middle of the 1990s, and here we see the virtue, the senatorial virtue of continuity. Here you see a resume of the 5 reports that were produced since then. So we have between maybe half of the resolutions which have been followed up, and since 87, you can see the different proportions between 2018 and 29. By 87% of cases, positions expressed by the Senate in these European resolutions were taken into account. So we can see how many of these resolutions have been voted, and the large proportion of your proposals which have been followed up on. And you can see there's a certain intensity with regard to scrutiny under 88.4 and with regard to proposals, we can see that the policy is well established. Please, if we could move on to the next slide. So we have several proposals. Some are more ambitious, and other involve constitutional reform. So we said that we would have to concentrate monitoring 88.4 on the acts of the Union, because there is a perverse effect of the enlargement of 88.4. We are seeing a dilution of resolutions, which are dealing with program bills, inviting more scrutiny of bills and directives and decisions. Now, this is outside the question of my intervention. The question of political dialogue must be reconsidered between this defensive and offensive types of position. We need a better articulation between the parliamentary oversight and legislative functions, notably within the question of the transposition of directives. And it would seem that this legislative role, and you know how involved both assemblies are involved in that, there should be a better insertion in the legislative process of these different European Affairs committees in both assemblies. And so members of parliament in both houses who make proposals for resolutions, they should be involved in the legislative transposition and work on identical text. With regard to a renewed constitutional framework, I haven't done much work here. I simply repeated the proposals which are formulated in the 2 houses of parliament here in France. The first you can see is changing the nature of the resolutions, and consider, initially, this is a proposal which is made to the group, to the Les Républicains group. So the government is bound to respect the joint resolution of the assemblies. So there's no scope, there's no range, normative range, if you like. This in the constitutional vision of 1998. Then it's a question of changing the nature of resolutions according to their purpose and or the way they are adopted. So the government is obliged to respect the joint resolutions of the assemblies in the area of freedom, security and justice adopted in public session. Here again, we can mix criteria. We could change the domain. We could remove or add votes in public session. And so here, a question of degree of resolution and whether or not resolutions should be taken account of by governments. So here we come closer to the Danish system in the relationship between the different assemblies. So in order to finish, my conclusion is very simple. It's inherent. In reality, the policy of the government at the European level is determined broadly by what comes from the European Council. So there's a blind spot here, an obstacle, which is very difficult to get beyond, because once again, there's this institution, this hybrid institution, which has a central role in Europe. And I know that your committee has had hearings with regard to the role of the European Council. We know it's difficult to displace the government perspective in its focus. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Didier, for this intervention, which illustrates not only the diversity of the practices within national parliaments, but also the difficulty we have to reconcile the national and European functions of national parliaments. This intervention underlines how much the consequence of decisions taken by national parliaments in European institutions are influential. And perhaps we could introduce the presentations which will follow. What are the consequences for the Council if governments approve mandates, parliaments approve mandates? So before I hand over to Madame Molenberg, I think that President Rapin would like to make an intervention. Yeah, in view of your slides, and notably on the parliamentary activity, the reduction that we note between 2019 and 2020, if I remember your slide properly, there are two things are essential. One is the renewal of the European institutions, so with lower activity in Strasbourg and Brussels, and then secondly, the COVID crisis. And because we were in, it was extremely difficult to operate. There was virtually no parliamentary activity, very few sessions, and this had an impact on parliamentary working, at least in its role as in a scrutiny role. The second point on the last slide, with regard to substantial operational modes, giving a mandate. I think this is good. Then Parliament should have a mandate. The question, the articulation between the assemblies is important. Should we function on an identical way to those that are national legislative texts, or should we work in a more offset way? Who knows? Perhaps in the form of a Congress, with the possibility of voting in Congress with both National Assembly and Senate together in Congress. And I think there is some positive thinking to be done here, because the solution will not be easy to find. You know, if we have a mandate from the National Assembly, a mandate from the Senate, or we could have a mandate from a Congress. Well, one thing I'd like to specify, what you've succeeded in obtaining under Article 88.7 is voting identically when you know that there is a revision of treaties which is simplified. The Senate obtained that it should be a motion which should be accepted in identical terms, which brought into question the veto. Yes, in positive law, there is something which already exists. But this is the context is a little different. It's a treaty. So there is diversity here too. Thank you very much for these first exchanges. I'm now going to hand the floor to Madame Molenberg-Nordfoss. I'm sorry, I hope I pronounced your name properly. From the in the Swedish Parliament.
Much. Yes, you pronounced my name perfect. Do you hear me? Yes? Yeah, good. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to take part in this important event. I'm so sorry I'm not in Paris. I'm in Stockholm, where it's minus 16 degrees this morning, so it's very chilly. Now I try to share my screen and see if I manage with that. You see my screen now, right? Yes.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you very much. Before I'm going into the role of the EU committee, I'll just give you a brief background on the role of the government and the role of the different units and parts of the parliament. As you know, the government, of course, represents Sweden in all EU matters, and it formulates Swedish EU policies, and of course negotiate with other member states on EU matters, and informs and deliberates with the Parliament on positions on EU matters. And the Parliament monitors EU issues, submits its view on EU matters to the government, gives mandate to the government on Swedish positions in the EU, and may demand the government to present its view before the relevant committees. And here this is a picture of the Swedish Parliament, and just to show that EU matters are dealt with different parts of the Parliament. Within the 15 sectorial committees, within the Committee of EU Affairs, of course, we have an EU coordination secretariat. EU matters are also dealt with within the chamber. We have the research service and so on. And this picture shows the main bodies dealing with EU matters. The different sectorial committees, it's like the Employment Committee, the Committee for Agriculture Policies and so on, they are responsible for the subsidiarity checks. And as you might know, Sweden is very high in ranking when it comes to subsidiarity checks. So the committees put lots of efforts on this. And also, the committees can ask the government for information and consultation on EU dossiers. I come back to that later, but the main idea here is that the committees come into the EU process as early as possible. A sectorial committee can ask the government for an information even before a proposal is put on the table from the Commission. So that's the way the committees can come into the EU process and affect the result and as early as possible. And then the EU committee, here we see our former Prime Minister. As you might know, we have a new Prime Minister since last Tuesday, Ms. Magdalena Andersson, and so we have a new government entered into force last Tuesday. But this is Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, and also the former chair of the EU committee. She's now chair of the Committee on Finance. But the EU committee, I will come back to that, is responsible for information and consultation with the government before the council meetings and before meetings in the European Council, and also informal meetings of the European Council. And in the chamber, the Prime Minister is responsible for reporting back from meetings in the European Council in the chamber. There are also EU debates in the chamber. And this is a bit what I said already. The parliamentary committees are responsible for drafting statements, deliberation, information, examination of EU initiatives and subsidiarity checks. Yes, I think I already explained the different roles. Here is a picture of a meeting with the EU committee. The committee has its meeting behind closed doors, except when it's a meeting with the Prime Minister before a meeting in the European Council or an informal meeting of the European Council. So why is there a Committee on EU Affairs in the Swedish system, in the Swedish Parliament? It's actually according to our constitution. According to the Riksdag Act, it says that the government shall inform the Committee on EU Affairs on matters which are to be decided by the Council of the European Union. The government should also consult the committee regarding the conduct of negotiations in the Council prior to decisions in the Council. And what you see here, it's not only decision points in the Council, but also discussions. The government needs a mandate before taking part in a discussion on a Council meeting in Brussels or Luxembourg. And that's according to our constitution. Yes, now I'm going to talk about the Committee of EU Affairs a bit more into detail. The committee deals with all areas of cooperation in the EU. So the committee or the deputies sitting there, they have very broad overview on all EU issues. They deal with everything from fisheries, agriculture. Last Friday, we had a very long meeting dealing with the minimum wage directive for the EPSCO Council today. We have the energy, transport, everything is on the table. What the EU committee does not do is to draft proposal for parliamentary decisions, and we don't perform subsidiarity checks. That's for the sectorial committees to do. The Committee of EU Affairs has 17 members. All committees in the Swedish Parliament have 17 members, but lots of deputy members. So approximately 70 deputy members. There are 5 Social Democrats, 4 members from the Moderate Party, 3 from the Sweden Democrats, and 1 from the rest of the different political parties within the Swedish Parliament. The chair of the committee is now Mr. Pyry Niemi. He's from the Social Democrats. Now we'll be very practical and very detailed, maybe how the committee works. As I said, the committee deals with all items on the council agenda. So the meetings are regular on Fridays, and then we go through all the council meetings the week that follows. So if it's a decision, decision on the council meeting, yes, the government present its position in written on Monday, and then the members also get the different documents. It could be the documents for Coreper because it's a bit early in the process already on the Monday, so the members can prepare themselves for the meetings on Friday. So both decision points, discussions, and also information. And the work of the committee is to give a mandate before the council meetings. So either what I forgot to say, it's that the meetings, we have stenographic notes, so you can see afterwards what was actually said, what mandate was given, so it's very easy to follow up. But the meeting starts with that the minister coming to the committee reports back from the last council meetings, so that's a way for members to follow up what was said, how did the discussions go, and after that it's we go through the agenda for the council meeting, every point, and the minister presents its position orally, and the members of the committee can ask questions and make contributions to the position of the government. And if the members don't agree, they make a reservation. And if there are not, if the majority of the committee is not in favor of the position, the government is forced to say no to a proposal, for instance, or adjust its position. So, because it has to have a mandate that reflects the majority of the committee. Yes, dissenting opinions, or, as I said, reservations. So the importance for the minister or the government is to see, oh, we have a majority of the EU committee in favor of our proposals. So it could be that, for instance, a majority of the committee say no, we want the government to say no to this proposal, and then the minister or the government needs to change its position. So it's a very strong role of the committee, I would say. What is also very particular for the Swedish system is written consultation on all items on the council agenda. And that's, you remember, I read out what's in our constitution. It said consultation need to be taken before decisions in the council. And of course, items are decision points. So our members get lots of drafts from the government with the proposal for a position to give a position on as well. So it's very thorough, I would say, our system. And what I've explained now is like a normal situation. During the pandemic, it was, of course, different. We had digital meetings, and also, as I guess you all know, there was the ministers, there were no formal council meetings for a long time. It was video conferences, and all decisions were taken with a written procedure. But then our members of the committee had to have written consultation, all these decisions that was taken with written procedure. So it was quite a lot of work, I have to say. I think I stopped there to allow some time for questions. Thank you.
Oui, merci infiniment pour votre présentation de ce système suédois qui nous est peut-être plus inconnu.
Which is not as familiar to us as some other European systems may be. I am now going to give the floor to Ms. Knudsen or Mr. Knudsen for the Danish Parliament, and then we'll open the discussion.
M'avoir invité à ce colloque que je trouve très très intéressant et
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very important and interesting colloquium. I have prepared a little presentation. It will come up on screen shortly. I work in the Danish Parliament and have done since 2013, always with the European affairs, and I work as a representative of the Danish Parliament in Brussels and have done since 2019. I'm going to talk about parliamentary scrutiny of the European policy in Denmark, how it works, and where the advantages and disadvantages of the system lie. So, since the beginning, there's been a mandate type of system. And this is a role that gives an important role to Parliament because we have a tradition for minority parliaments. That means that usually the government is not a majority. The Constitution says that the government can't remain in power if there is a majority against the government. There's no question of a majority for government. In Denmark, it is a member of the European Union and has been since 1973, almost 50 years now. During these 50 years, we have had a majority government only for 8 months in and out of 50 years. So the right-wing governments often benefit from support from the far right, and the left-wing governments often have support from the far left for national questions, but neither the extreme left or right support the European Union, but they are against everything that is all European proposals for legislation. So the different governments in Denmark are obliged to work via the parliament and to collaborate with the major parties in the centre. In the council, it's imperative that all governments of the member states engage the countries to apply European legislation. Since the beginning, it was clear that it was necessary to develop a system in order to ensure that the Danish parliament wouldn't throw out things that were negotiated by the Danish government with the other member states. The mandate system has been in place consequently since 1973, and this is how it works. The government, so the ministry, assesses the new proposals for European legislation. If it's important, the government must inform the parliament. If it has a major impact on Denmark, the government is obliged to present its position, the position that the government will take in negotiation. This position is presented to the Parliamentary Commission of European Affairs. And this is in order to ensure that there is no majority against the government's position. And that's the mandate. If the parties don't express an opinion against the government's position, it also accepts to vote for that legislation. And then if this is a law that has to be applied to in Danish law. So in practical terms, the ministers that get together in Brussels or Luxembourg, they will. Sorry, I've gone ahead too fast. It infirms on the proposals, on the members' bills. And if there is a proposal or several proposals for European legislation that will have a major impact on Denmark, the minister has to present his position, the position in order to obtain mandate from Parliament. If it is the government who considers when it is the right moment to present its position, this should be before the position of the Council is adopted, normally before Coreper adopts its position. Normally, there are between 60 to 80 mandates per year. The mandate is always presented orally, but the government transmits memos on the proposal for legislation, on the draft, including the general position of the government, so the members of Parliament have an idea of in which direction this will head. The members of Parliament ask their questions to the minister, they discuss, and during the meeting, the parties say if they agree with the minister or not. The meetings are open to the public, they are televised and also broadcast online. So the parties are consulted by the minister before the meetings in order to know if there is a majority for or a majority against. So it's kind of like a theatre. The positions have already been established and agreed, and the negotiations in back rooms and corridors have been completed. The roles are distributed. Everyone knew who's going to support the government and who's not going to support the government. Here you can see the parties who support the government. A is the Socialist Party. They're present in the government, so they're 100%. They agree with themselves. This is reassuring. On the other side, you see the three lowest parties. These are the extreme left and extreme right. But you can see they agree with the government about half of the time, for about half of the mandates, roughly. There is also another thing. We also monitor, we scrutinize the principle of subsidiarity. There's not much interest for this principle. There's about 10 proposals per year. There's not much interest in parliamentarians because just there's simply the possibility of stopping something, and that's very difficult. There's no possibility to influence or to change something. We also have a meeting with the Prime Minister prior to and subsequent to each meeting at the European Council. But the mandates come to the Prime Ministers because the European Council can, if they don't adopt proposals, but there can be positions which are important that are taken at the European Council level. So in theory, this is a system which gives a lot of power to Parliament. And when I say in theory, that is because in practice, there are drawbacks too. First of all, the mandates are presented too late for the Parliamentary European Affairs Committee. When COREPER adopts its position, the negotiations in Brussels have already lasted for a long time. They're almost finished, and it's difficult to change anything. And the influence of Parliament on European affairs is very restricted. And this is the fault of the Danish Parliament. If it's a left-wing government or a right-wing government, it doesn't change anything. But this is a problem. There's another problem, and that is the number of individuals involved in European affairs. There are very few of them. The Parliamentary Committee for European Affairs has 29 members, but in practice there is only one person from each party who participates in the meetings. They deal with everything, and they draft proposals for the industry, agriculture, foreign affairs, everything. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of information, a lot of documents involved. The other parliamentary committees only rarely deal with European affairs. The presidents of the parties don't either. So the problem is that there are possibilities to become engaged at European level which are not used. The political dialogue with the European Commission, for example, above all, before these proposals for law legislation are presented, because it's there where we'd have a greater opportunity for having influence. The Danish Parliament isn't much involved in public consultations in the phase upstream from the proposals, the presentation of proposals for legislation. 1.5 years ago, the Parliamentary European Affairs Committee decided to form a group of people with a lot of experience in European affairs in order to give ideas for improving the way that we worked on European subjects in the Danish Parliament. And in October, the group gave its recommendations. First of all, they recommended that the other parliamentary committees should be involved and give a mandate to government, a very general mandate, 7 weeks after the presentation. So this is very further upstream in the whole process. Then the government should present its positions earlier to the European Affairs Committee, let's say 3 months after the presentation, in order to obtain a more specific mandate. Furthermore, The presidents of the political parties should discuss priorities and decide which are the most important priorities for Denmark, and the Parliament should concentrate on those bills, in order also, as you have already mentioned, sir, in order to have a more offensive policy and less defensive policy. And it should concentrate its efforts in order not to dissipate its efforts by working on everything. It's also important to collaborate with the different organizations in civil society. And also another recommendation, in order to implement a system of reporters with the parliamentary system, we know that already takes place in the European Parliament. The rapporteurs can become involved very early in the process before presentation of legislation, and they can be involved at the European level with the European Commission, the Parliament, and also the other national parliaments. So we don't yet know if there are a majority for these recommendations. I hope there will be, but we shall see. Wait and see. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having enlightened us on this Danish case, which is very instructive. I would like to hand over to the audience, both distant and here present, for questions. So perhaps we should specify the mode of the evolution of these governments as Swedish and Danish. We have two constitutional monarchies, one which is monocameral, and the other is bicameral. So Denmark, you have both monocameral parliaments. So this is an important element with regard to influence, with regard to initiative in this. So it's your initiatives are facilitated by the fact that you have just one parliamentary assembly, and not two as we have here in France.
Oui.
Oui, bonjour.
I have a question. Olivier Rosenberg from Sciences Po. I have a question for Mr. Blanc, if I may. I want to thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting, but I'm a bit surprised by the drop in the number of European resolutions. You were very diplomatic in your presentation and saying that it's not a matter for concern, but is it not a sign, amongst other signs, of a marginalization of our parliament during the current term, or that other parliaments may have more flexible and more informal influence? Yes, dear colleague, thank you very much for your question. I was not trying to be diplomatic here, because there have been reports in the National Assembly that were a lot less diplomatic, saying that it was tantamount to using a wooden sword, which of course means the war you wage is quite different. I was struck, same as you, but over a long time period, over the last 30 years or 20 years, I've seen a lot of continuity, whatever political parties in power in. So a lot of continuity in the way parliamentary scrutiny has been put in place pursuant to Article 88.4. It's true of the National Assembly. Why would it not be true of the Senate? But there's the case law of Constitutional Council that requires for a transposition of the directives. And since there is the point of parliamentary scrutiny on draft directives or proposals for directives is sort of loses its meaning. I think the debate has changed. There's what has been put forward is the over transposition or excessive transposition of directives. So I think it's a whole system-wide reflection on the role of assemblies in terms of scrutiny and their legislative function, and more specifically in transposing directives, because they are obliged to transpose directives. So, and I'm going to be very blunt here, why waste time on examining resolutions? But that's not true of the Senate, where there's more continuity. So I cannot give you a very straight answer, as you can see. Thank you very much. Any further questions in the on-site, amongst the on-site audience or the virtual audience? Well, if that's not the case, I'll use my role as co-chair to share a few reflections that might feed into, might fuel the debate, picking up on the presentation by Elena Grillo about the national function and the European function, and the dialogue with EU institutions. Seems to me that national parliaments are as national institutions, but sort of Europeanized institutions, have to fulfill three functions. The first is traditional. It is a scrutiny of draft legislation. I'll come back to it. The second is scrutiny, or at least monitoring what's happening in Brussels at the Council of Ministers, Council of the European Union, but also the Eurogroup. And the third function has to do with the impact of the national activity following European integration. And I think the last one has, with all the recovery plans, has evolved. And I think the debate is too fragmented, because what happens at the Council will have an impact on the national parliamentary business, if only in terms of budgetary activity. And so there's always been talk of national parliaments participation, and a lot of national parliaments have not really been associated in these debates by the government. So should we select some draft legislation as it's been put forward by Denmark, and if so, on what basis? Because some governments had considered in the past, and I think it was the case here at the French Senate, the possibility of selecting on the basis of the European semester agenda or the European Commission agenda, which is a first approximative idea of what the Commission will do. Is it the right document, and how can it be done? And my second question, which has to do with monitoring and follow-up, which is too fragmented, because it's focused on when the draft legislation is put forward and during the transposition. But in very few national parliaments, there is a real conversation about what's going to happen. So maybe in the light of the different experiences in the different national parliaments that we have represented here, is there a better way to associate parliaments with more continuity, and not only focusing on certain steps? And also wanted to touch upon the priority in the presentation of the French case of draft legislation. I wonder if it still makes sense in different regards, because soft law has an impact indisputably on the action of national parliaments, but also on national legislative systems. And also because at the end of the day, if we look at the example of the European semester or recovery plans, it's not hard law that is being adopted. So should we not diversify the action of national parliaments without rather than focusing on a system that only focuses on a European legislative act? So maybe to just fuel the debate. I see that it's inspired some reactions in the on-site audience. Yes, thank you, Pierre Laurent. I'm a senator and I sit on the European Affairs Committee here at the French Senate. I think the question of upstream mandate is absolutely essential because in truth, at least I'm speaking from a French vantage point, what the current system is lacking is the question of the double mandate, because since we are in a negotiation process, it can not only be an imperative mandate, and then that does not factor in the negotiation. Currently, this doesn't exist, doesn't really exist. And I think it's an avenue worth exploring in the specific characteristics of France with two chambers. We have to see how that can be implemented, but it is an important question because nobody's talked about the context, but we find ourselves in a context where there's a crisis of trust in the EU and the European construction. So we have to build that truth, that trust. And this is very important for our democracies. And the other thing I wanted to say is that in France, we seem to have also left out one important factor, which is that the chief negotiator for France, which is the French president, does not is not accountable to the parliament. The ministers are accountable, but we have a chief negotiator who finds himself in an institutional function that puts him above the parliament, which is, from a democratic perspective, a bit of a problem when you ask yourself the question of effective parliamentary scrutiny, which is not the case for a majority of European countries, in which the head of the government that negotiates at the Council, the European Council, is accountable directly to the Parliament. But that's not the case in France, which is a real problem when we talk about negotiation mandate at a European level. Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to our panelists who might want to respond. Well, thank you, Senator. We are the only state in which the member of the European Council is part of the executive branch, but not the head of government, so does not have that political responsibility. So the only contact between the French president and the parliamentary chambers are when both parliamentary chambers meet, and when the French president outlines its European policy and the question of associating private citizens to European policy. So in the Fifth Republic, it is probably quite detrimental. The examples of Sweden and Denmark have demonstrated that it's not only a problem because of the lack of accountability, but also because we have two parliamentary chambers, unlike Sweden and Denmark, that only have one. Which is not to say that we're ready for having only one chamber instead of two in France. That cannot be the argument in favor of having only one chamber in our parliament. You mentioned recovery plans and consultation models. If I remember correctly, when it comes to recovery plans, there was only one debate at the Assembly with the ratification at the end of it. And there's a second point where we were consulted, which was, in my view, a very strong debate, which was about own resources. That was directly linked to recovery plans, because we had a debate that was really interesting. It's one of those rare occurrences where the Senate actually supported the government on this. Thank you very much for the additional information. Did you want to say something, madam? Yes, thank you. Just in response to your first question about the selection of draft legislation, we already do that on the basis of the Commission's agenda, because I think that when we look at the agenda of the presidency, that's too late. You have to do it more upstream. The agenda of the Commission gives you an idea of what draft legislation has been planned. I think many national parliaments already do this on this basis, and we discuss it amongst ourselves. But we could do it even better when there are more people involved in these European Union affairs, which is our proposal. There was an initiative in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, from the Dutch Parliament that had which was to coordinate the positions of national parliaments as they review the Commission's work. And I wondered if it was not a way to make it more attractive to have a more active participation, more proactive participation in the review of European affairs. And I think national parliaments, a lot of national parliaments agree that the check on subsidiarity, for example, are not really attractive because they're viewed as only negative. What we called refit, which is the review of already existing legislative acts, to tell the Commission about what's happening in member states and what adjustments need to be made should the case arise. I think that's really interesting. It's a really good idea, but in practice, that would generate problems because national parliaments work according to different schedules. So it's probably not as easy to implement as you might think. Thank you very much. Any further questions or comment? Maybe in the virtual room or from our panelists from this morning who'd like to say something?
Follow up on the point and the connection between the ex-ante scrutiny of EU affairs of national parliaments and their role in implementing EU directives and regulations, because I think that many parliaments have understood the connection between these two functions, and the Italian parliament is one of these. I mean, Italian parliament was very weak in scrutinizing EU affairs, but after many infringement procedures, it has understood that getting involved in EU affairs from the very early stages of the EU decision-making process is fundamental for anticipating some of the issues that will be debated in the implementation process. And I think that this is part of the Europeanization process that has features on Southern European countries. And the second reaction is on this cross-fertilization of scrutiny models in Europe, which I think is a sort of reaction by national parliaments to the marginalization of their position, because the latest crisis in the European Union, Euro crisis, but also Brexit and the COVID-19 crisis has marginalized in a certain way, I mean, the role of parliaments at the domestic level in the interaction with their own executives. And I think that many parliaments are trying to gain back some spheres of control by strengthening their involvement in the European affairs area. And I think that this is, in different ways we are seeing this, especially in those countries as Italy, which were not so strong in the scrutiny of EU affairs. And thank you.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Elena, pour ces quelques précisions. Y a-t-il d'autres...
Thank you very much, Elena, for these specifications and additional comments. Any further comment or question? maybe one last question then, on what was mentioned by Didier Blanc about the use of resolutions within the framework of political dialogue, and in particular, how it how we combine, or what kind of a connection we make between national parliaments and European policy. So there are different ways for national parliaments to actually have an influence through the European Central Bank, through the European Court of Accounts, and other EU institutions. But I'd like to ask the opposite question, which is that, is it not normal that when a national parliament has formed a political, issued a political opinion, should they not make it known to Brussels? Is there not a contradiction? Could you maybe rephrase the question? Well, it seemed to me that you were formulating a criticism with regards to the fact that resolutions be reused as part of political dialogue, to put it bluntly. Well, it seems to me that a national parliament should identify its political position regarding a concrete legislative proposals, and then should express and share it with the Commission and MEPs, because the point is to share that position and make it known. So I have no problem with that.
Simplement le constat qu'on a un contenu identique.
This is not a criticism. We have identical elements of the resolution and the political advice. So the resolution, it's not using political dialogue. That's not a subject. So outside the political dialogue, it picks up on what's in the resolution. The reality of the content of the political dialogue and the resolution don't have the same object, the same objective. And so the political dialogue is central because the proposals from the Commission can be modified unanimously by states. So the influence of the Commission and the proposals adopted. So I'm not criticizing political dialogue, it's simply central. And simply the larger procedure should have a greater impact than resolutions. And so that's why the importance of the identity between political dialogue and resolutions. Because otherwise this question of defensiveness involved the problem of the parliamentary scrutiny of government. This is why it's so important to have the identity between resolutions and political dialogue. Sometimes they damage the principle of subsidiarity. Sometimes it's a question of better use of parliamentary resources. So, okay, we've got to the end of the first session of this morning's debate. Can you hear me? I would like to ask a question. The tool which is available to parliaments as resolutions, it seems a bit rigid. The parliament can only intervene once on a proposal. And so there's a question of timing, the moment at which Parliament uses this instrument, and it's not obvious. Our Danish colleague was saying we should do it earlier, and that's what they're proposing to their Parliament, with the risk that it would be offset subsequently. And so this raises the question of a more flexible instrument, which would be able to follow the state of draft texts. Shouldn't we think more not in terms of political expression, but of associating national parliaments in the negotiation process? that it should be more informal. We've seen that's where influence can really be exercised, rather than at the moment when there is, when we have things which are more established, where Parliament's influence would be is less effective, as we've seen. Shouldn't we, Parliaments, be able to be involved at the level of negotiation, and would that not be a more practical proposal, given what we've heard this morning? Thank you very much for underlining this important issue. Perhaps, Lotte, Joanna, or Elena, would you like to share the experience of your national parliaments?
There are some parliaments who are engaging in the scrutiny process before the working groups in the council are formed, which means that they are able to follow the decision-making from the very beginning. Other parliaments are instead intervening once the legislative proposal is published, and so which means that the power to influence the negotiating process is more limited. And I mentioned the Finnish case, which is one of the parliaments which is scrutinizing the decision-making throughout the process. So from the very beginning, since working groups are formed, and then the Swedish parliament is also able to be informed by the government on the negotiating process while the meetings are pending, which means that it's an ongoing process, scrutiny process. So not just an early scrutiny, but also throughout the decision making, which means that there's a lot of work to be done for committees, and this raises the problem of the time constraints that European Affairs committees are facing, but also resource constraints. So this is one of the problems, and of course, the interparliamentary cooperation can support national parliaments in identifying which legislative proposals are most relevant, and also to share information about the positions that they are going to adopt. But at the moment, the formal conferences, interparliamentary conferences, are not able to support national parliaments in this role. And so this informal coordination on the position in the ongoing negotiation is rather interpreted by parliamentary officials in Brussels, by high representatives who coordinate and share informal information on this ongoing scrutiny. But I don't see formal procedures at the moment on the subject.
Merci beaucoup, Elena, d'avoir partagé ces quelques réflexions. Peut-être Lotte ou Joanna? Lotte.
Thank you very much, Elena. Perhaps Lotte? Yes, thank you for this question. I think it's a very important question, because the proposals that we have had from these groups, who are very experienced, is that first of all, the presidents of political parties must decide on the priorities on the subjects in order to, with regard to the work of the Commission. There may be 10 or 20, and we should concentrate efforts on those. The parliamentary committees should find a rapporteur for each of those subjects, and the period during which the proposal has not been presented, the rapporteurs can go to Brussels or to the other capitals of member states in order to exchange, discuss, and to find the other people who are in the same positions, and to work on these subjects which are already on the table. With regard, when the proposal is presented, governments must get a mandate in the relevant committee. This must be a very general mandate, which gives an idea of the direction that this will take during negotiations. But naturally, it couldn't be a very specific mandate, because the negotiations will only have begun in Brussels. Then later on, the government should get back to Parliament in order to get a final, more specific mandate. And that is difficult to know exactly when, and it's always the Danish government that decides when, but it should be earlier in the process, otherwise it's too late to have any influence. And so there's a lot. This involves a lot of work, and this is why we have to concentrate our minds and our work on the most important subjects. But if it's going to be like that, I don't know. This hasn't yet been decided. I don't know if we will follow those recommendations. For the time being, we just have one mandate, but that mandate intervenes too late. Thank you. Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, sorry, yes, okay, the one in the room.
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the important question. Yes, as I tried to explain earlier, it's for the sectorial committees to ask or demand the government to come to the committee in an earlier stage, even before a proposal is put on the table, to consult and inform and get a mandate for the negotiations. And actually, if 5 members of the committee, they can actually force, it's a strong word, but they can ask the minister, if just 5 members out of 17 ask for the minister to come to the committee in any EU matters. So that could also be with the trilogues with the parliament or earlier stage or several times during a negotiation. So that's quite strong, I would say. But of course, very time consuming.
Merci beaucoup. Nous avions encore une intervention de la salle. Je vous en prie.
Oui.
Thank you very much. We have a question from the floor. Yes, thank you very much for your question, for your interventions. Ron. I have a question with regard to COSAC, with regard to Eurodeputies, with regard to there's a proposition by Madame Tillet on the creation of working groups. How do you see, how can we use COSAC to reinforce the influence of national parliaments? And use it to increase parliamentary influence in European matters. I was going to make the same proposition. What I would like you to do, please keep your question for session number 3 on parliamentary cooperation, interparliamentary cooperation. So I think that is the concluding words of the first session. It's been very full. And there's a lot of avenues for further thinking. So let's have a quarter of an hour break, and we'll get back at 11:30. Thank you.